but I'll give you some insight as to what the view states, but I also want to constrain the scope of what my thesis will be attempting to address. I'll say something briefly about my free will skepticism. A lot of my work has been defending this view of free will skepticism, and I've argued that our best philosophical and scientific theories should lead us to accept free will skepticism, and I'll say why it's inconsistent with retributivism, but that's not going to be the focus of my talk. So I'm going to try to focus on three, which is offering you, say if you don't buy my free will skepticism, there might still be an epistemic argument against retributive legal punishment that would undermine leading compatibilist and libertarian attempts to justify retributive punishment. You guys have already read, or some of you read in my writing sample, my views on the public health quarantine model. If there's a minute or two at the end, I might just briefly summarize that so you could have another whack at me on that if you want. But I didn't want to repeat what you had already read, and then I'll go into questions and take whatever questions you have. So just quickly, within the criminal justice system, one of the most prominent justifications for legal punishment is retributivism. And the retributive justification for punishment maintains that the punishment of a wrongdoer is justified for the reason that he or she deserves to suffer for some wrong that they've done. And this could include pain, deprivation, say all the way up to the death penalty. And we'll see in a moment, one of the things I want to stress is that retributive punishment is generally backwards looking, non-consequential, and it's predicated and assumes that agents deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done. So it appeals to notions of just deserts. So one of the books that I hope to finish writing is titled Unjust Deserts, because I'm not a retributivist. And so if you look at the law, you don't have to read all the citations there, but if you're interested, a number of sentencing guidelines in the U.S. have adopted desert as their distributive principle. You could, again, look at some of the codes down there. And it's increasingly given deference in the purpose section of a lot of criminal codes, where it can guide the principles and the interpretation and the application of the code's provisions. You might be aware that the Model Penal Code was recently revised, and they have set desert as the official dominant principle for sentencing. I wrote a piece in Psychology Today lamenting the revision. I belong to a network called the Justice Without Retribution Network, so you know where I stand on retribution. And I think it was a bad revision. And although they have other functions for punishment articulated, they become secondary in the new revision to retributivism. And the courts have identified desert as the guiding principle in a variety of contexts, and the Supreme Court has enthroned retributivism as, quote, the primary justification for the death penalty. So it plays a central role in our criminal legal system, especially in the United States. And although at times we move further away from it, we seem to be moving further toward it again. So this is Mitchell Berman. He is a legal scholar and a retributivist. He defends a kind of moderate retributivism, which I'll define in a moment. But here's a good quote summarizing retributivism. He says, a person who unjustifiably and inexcusably causes or risks harm to others or to significant social sanctions deserves to suffer for that wrong. And he deserves to suffer in proportion to the extent to which his regard or concern for others falls short of what is properly demanded of him. So the notion of desert, right? These individuals deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done. You might be aware of Michael Moore, probably one of the best known legal scholars and defenders of retributivism, defends a slightly more extreme form of retributivism, but he echoes Mitchell Berman's account and also highlights the purely backward-looking aspect of retributivism. So he says, retributivism is the view that we ought to punish offenders because and only because they deserve to be punished. Punishment is justified for a retributivist solely by the fact that those receiving it deserve it. Punishment may deter crime, it may incapacitate dangerous persons, educate citizens, all these other potential things, reinforce social cohesion, prevent vigilante behavior, make victims of crime feel better, satisfy vengeful desires of citizens. Yet for a retributivist, these are happy surpluses that punishment produces and form no part of what makes punishment just. For a retributivist, deserving offenders should be punished even if the punishment produces none of these other goods, right? So it's purely backward-looking, right, in this regard. So if you give that person their just desserts, it doesn't matter if it morally educates them, if it makes society safer, if it leads to rehabilitation. Those are not the goals of retributive punishment. Okay. So the thing to highlight there is that on these accounts of retributivism, it's grounded in the notion of desert. And the concept of desert here being invoked is basic, in my language, basic desert, which is not reducible to consequentialist or forward-looking goods such as the safety of society, moral formation, etc. And you see that very clearly in the quotes, especially Michael Moore's quote. So for the retributivists, human beings are sometimes morally responsible in the basic desert sense. And again, the basic desert sense of moral responsibility states that agents are responsible for their actions in a sense that would make them truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward, in this backward-looking, non-consequential sense. So you got my definition of basic desert. Okay. And therefore, we're justified in giving them their just deserts in the form of punishment for moral or legal offenses. So I'm going to mention 3 different kinds of retributivism, only to set aside the first, weak retributivism. And I'm not even sure weak retributivism is retributivism. I'm just including it because I've seen some taxonomies that include it. Many retributivists would deny this is even a form of retributivism, and I'll explain on the next slide why. I'm going to just set it aside for the sake of today. But weak retributivism maintains that negative desert, which is what the law is concerned with, punishment, is merely necessary but not sufficient for punishment. So weak retributivism is really consistent with a consequentialist view of punishment, just side constrained by negative desert. So in this case, if there were no further goods that came for punishing a person who deserves to be punished, the law would not be able to punish them. On some definitions of retributivism, that's just even excluded from a concept of retributivism, but I include it there. Moderate retributivism maintains that negative desert is necessary and sufficient for punishment, but the desert does not mandate punishment. So there might be overriding goods, reasons in society not to give something, an offender, punishment that they deserve. I would say most retributivists sort of fall there. And then stronger retributivism maintains that desert is not only necessary and sufficient for punishment and mandates punishment. The clearest example there would probably be Kant's famous passage, if you're familiar with the Island Society passage. But he says anyone who commits a murder not only deserves to die, but has to die. There's no other alternative than the death penalty for someone who commits a murder. And he says if you wanted an island and this island society was going to disband and scatter around the world and there was one remaining murderer in prison, not only would he deserve to be executed, you have an obligation to execute him before you leave the island. And you have to give him his just deserts. Right? And it's not because he's going to pose a threat to anyone else on the island. No one's going to be left. It's not for moral formation. It's not for deterrence. It's simply for retribution. And required retribution. There are very few people that sort of defend that stronger version. So I'm going to limit my scope to moderate and strong, and then I'm going to even sort of drop the distinction, because all I'm really interested in is whether desert is enough to be sufficient to justify legal punishment. And so I can set aside the question of whether it's required or just justified. But weak retributivism doesn't fit with most of the leading accounts, and you can think of Kant, Moore, Kirchner, Husak, Douglas Husak, and Mitchell Berman. They all defend stronger versions. So I want to have I want to address those that are the standard views, not some outlier that almost no one defends. Weak retributivism is considered by even many retributivists to be too weak to guide the criminal law. This is a quote from Alexander Faraz and Stephen Morse. And they say it amounts to nothing more than desert-free consequentialism, side constrained by negative desert. David Boonin, is that how you say it? Yeah. And his book on punishment, he actually, the way he defines retributivism is that it's sufficient for punishment. And so it would exclude weak retributivism from the beginning. And the way the criminal law gives the concept of desert, especially in the U.S., seems to imply that the law indicates desert is often sufficient. So I'm going to just set that up. Really quick, I'm also constraining my conversation to legal punishment, and I'm happy to accept Michael Zimmerman's definition of legal punishment in his book on the immorality of punishment. So this comes from chapter 1. Actually, this might even come from your preface, but it's summarized in chapter 1, that legal punishment consists in one person's deliberately harming another on behalf of the state in a way that's intended to constitute a fitting response to some offense and to give expression to the state's disapproval of that offense. So legal punishment is distinct from interpersonal punishment. So I'm not addressing how I treat my daughter, whether I punish my daughter. I'm talking today just about legal punishment, right? And angry mobs carrying out justice is not going to be legal punishment because legal punishment usually involves a system of criminal law that guides punishment of individuals who commit crimes. Okay, so.
Sorry, Greg.
Yep.
Not to slow you down or anything. You kind of gave a justification for why you were leaving weak attributivism out of your analysis. Why are you restricting the analysis just to legal?
Because that's what I'm concerned with right now is policy and just legal punishment. The argument I want to give today, I'm only going to claim applies to legal punishment. Although I do think I have other views against any interpersonal, retributive, backwards-looking claim. So my view would exclude those two. But maybe this argument today might not be strong enough to do that. My free will skepticism would, but not this. Maybe not this epistemic. So we'll see. So now that the scope of my focus of my talk is set, we could ask the question: is retributive legal punishment justified? So now we have definition of legal punishment and hopefully an understanding of what I mean by retributivism. Okay. So one reason to think agents don't deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done in this purely backward-looking, non-consequential sense is that they're not free and morally responsible in the sense required for retributive punishment. So this is where I'm just going to very quickly say something about my free will skepticism. Not the focus of my talk, but for a long time I've defended this view of free will skepticism. I laid out my argument, my longer argument for free will skepticism in my book, my 2012 book on free will and consciousness. So free will skepticism maintains that who we are, what we do, is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and that could be because of determinism, chance, or even luck. And because of this, we're never morally responsible for our actions in this basic desert sense. Again, this is the sense that would make you truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward, in a, again, backward-looking, not non-consequential sense. Free will skepticism is consistent with other types of responsibility. And we could debate those later, but attributability, responsibility, answerability, responsibility I've argued, somewhat controversial. Attributability, not so controversial. And free will skepticism could be consistent with reasons for incapacitating individuals, and my account would give an account of that. But what it maintains is that holding individuals accountable in this basic desert sense for actions that are beyond their control would be ultimately unfair and unjust. Okay. There's a number of arguments that have historically been given that defend this view. The most famous, hard determinism, right? Back in the day, the claim being determinism is true and incompatible with free will and basic desert moral responsibility, either because determinism is inconsistent with the ability to do otherwise, leeway incompatibilism, or it's incompatible with the agent being the ultimate source of their actions, source incompatibilism. Okay. Most modern free will skeptics are agnostic about the truth or falsity of determinism or present arguments somewhat neutral on the question of whether universal determinism is the case. So I'm what's called a hard incompatibilist, so I follow Dirk Bierboom here. And so, like Dirk, against the view that free will is compatible with the causal determination of our actions by natural factors beyond our control, i.e. against compatibilism, I argue that there's no relevant difference between that prospect and our actions being causally determined by manipulators. So there's a whole bunch of manipulation arguments against compatibilism. Dirk Bierboom's four-case argument is an example. And don't worry you're not following this because it's not the focus of my talk. Just giving you my ultimate reason for rejecting retributivism. And unlike Peereboom, he sort of believes the Frankfurt cases work, and so the principle of alternative possibilities is not required. I'm not so sold by Frankfurt, and so I just want to say, to the extent that Frankfurt doesn't succeed and the ability to do otherwise is a necessary condition for free will, that also would fail to be compatible with determinism, because I don't think traditional conditional analyses work. And I've once half kidding but half serious said that conditional analyses amounts to the little could that would, but can't so won't. And so I think in the end that doesn't work. Against event causal libertarianism, so the most famous proponent here would be Robert Kane, but there are others. I object that on such accounts, agents are left unable to settle whether a decision will occur. So this is indeterminacy at the level of events. And Robert Kane spells out exactly where the indeterminacy has to occur. You have to have reasons backing two sets of outcomes. So you have a businesswoman who wants to proceed to her meeting and get there on time, but there is someone in need, and she also desires to stop and help the person in need. She has two actions that she has reasons for performing. They both have reasons backing explanations. But there's this ultimate stirring up of literally chaos in the brain. And this quantum indeterminacy percolates up to the level of neural networks. And whichever of the two outcomes occurs, he says you're responsible for because you have reasons for that action. But the problem I argue with those accounts is that on these accounts you can't settle which outcome occurs. And settling is required for control. And I think it fails to satisfy the control condition for free will. Agent causal libertarians, I say, could, in theory, satisfy the control requirement, but they don't fit with our best physical and scientific theories about the world. And I've elsewhere argued in my first book that it suffers also problems with mental causation. Some of you studied with Kim, Jaguar and Kim. So with the mental causation stuff, I think they run into problems when you adopt the kind of metaphysical view that's required for this notion of the agent. That said, I want to just say, if you accept any of that, you don't have to, and I haven't defended it here. Clearly, retributivism goes because it's inconsistent with the idea that agents truly deserve to suffer in the way required for retributive punishment. So as Peereboom says, if agents do not deserve blame just because they have knowingly done wrong, perhaps because no one deserves blame, then neither do they deserve to be punished because they had knowingly done wrong. So if you were to adopt free will skepticism, it would have a practical implication for the law. I'm also sympathetic, and actually now would also say that a lot of the non-retributive justifications for punishment, utilitarian consequentialists, fail. So I'm okay with being an abolitionist because my view is a non-punitive approach. And I think that would be an important component of my view. So, but what I want to focus on is, let's say you're not convinced of free will skepticism, and you're not sold that we lack basic desert moral responsibility. Oh, I should mention, I define free will in terms of basic desert moral responsibility. There are people who separate the two, but I've argued that free will should be defined as the control and action required for basic desert moral responsibility. At a Arkansas paper that just came out arguing that we should define free will, there are benefits for doing so. But if you don't do that, we could talk just in terms of basic desert responsibility of free will. So what I want to introduce is an epistemic argument. It's going to be spelled out on the next slide, but the basic idea behind it is that the burden of proof, I'm going to argue, lies on those who want to intentionally inflict harm. So if you want to harm someone, you have to have good justification for harming that person. And this means that retributivists who want to justify legal punishment on the assumption that agents are free and morally responsible, and hence justly deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done, must justify that assumption. And they must justify that assumption in a way that meets I'm going to argue, a very high epistemic bar, a high standard. Since the harms caused in this case are often quite severe. And this is why I'm going to say this argument, I'm going to not talk about interpersonal blame and things like that, because I'm not saying this is right, but you could argue that certain levels of harm only have to satisfy a lower epistemic bar, and certain more severe forms of harm have to satisfy a higher epistemic bar. And so punishing my daughter in a backwards-looking sense, let's say, although I think I'm justified because of my critical skepticism, you might say is less morally objectionable than putting someone in prison, separating them from their loved ones, removing individuals from the community, devastating households, taking away individuals who are the primary economic breadwinners for the family. 90% of the, or 60 to 80% of the women in prison are the primary caretakers for their children, so when you remove that, it has drastic effects on the family. And I'm going to argue it's simply not enough to point to the mere possibility that we possess libertarian or compatibilist free will, nor is it enough to say that the skeptical arguments against free will aren't conclusive. You can say, I'm sympathetic to your view, but you haven't proven that we don't have free will. That's not enough to hang your hat on. And I think a positive and convincing case has to be made that agents actually, in fact, are morally responsible in this basic desert sense. Since it's the backward-looking desert of agents that we're using in this case to justify retributive legal punishment. Yeah.
Does this apply to, I think you used the phrase negative desert earlier?
Yeah.
Does this apply to positive desert as well?
So Benjamin Billhauer is a friend of mine, a legal skeptic too. He defended an asymmetric account where he says it's easier to justify praise than it is to justify blame. On the grounds similar to this, that in many cases praise isn't as harmful. There are cases where it can be harmful. He's given some where he thinks it could be harmful. And so he thinks it needs to satisfy a lower epistemic bar than blame. I'm sympathetic to that. I'm more in the peer group. I don't think praise or blame is justified in any absolute sense.
And you're calling that your free will skeptic?
Yeah, I'm a free will skeptic, yeah.
Who is it that you said that?
Benjamin Billhauer. He's at, now I think he's at City College. Yeah. So I'll just put it all in there. So basically, here's the argument. Legal punishment inflicts harm on individuals. I'll say why, but I think that's pretty clear. And the justification for such harm has to meet a high epistemic standard. If it's significantly probable that one's justification for harming another is unsound, then it's prima facie that behavior is seriously wrong. The retributive justification for legal punishment assumes agents are morally responsible in this basic desert sense, and hence justly deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done. Of course, and I'm leaving out, appropriately qualified under the constraint of the principle of proportionality. But basically, desert is sufficient to justify a licensed backward-looking punishment that could serve no forward-looking good. And then 4, which I probably have to defend the most, but there might be something else I have to defend. The justification for the claim that agents are morally responsible in the basic desert sense, provided by both libertarians and compatibilists, face powerful and unresolved objections, and as a result fall far short of the epistemic bar needed to justify such harm. So given premise 1 and 2, legal punishment is unjustified and the harms it causes are prima facie seriously wrong. Follow the basic idea? Okay, so just restating premise 1, it basically places the burden of proof on those who want to justify legal punishment, since the harms caused in those cases are quite severe. Loss of liberty, deprivation, the effects on the family. It often devastates whole communities. We obviously have a mass incarceration problem that's been societally detrimental. And premise 2 adds that if it's significantly probable that one's justification for harming another is unsound, prima facie that behavior is seriously wrong. So I think support for those two premises can be found both in the law and in everyday practice. So the notion of the burden of proof comes to us, I think, from the adversarial courtroom, where it guides the presentation of evidence. And different burdens will have to be satisfied, whether we're talking about criminal law or civil law. So in both criminal and civil law, the defendant is presumed not guilty, right, or not liable. And it's up to the accuser to persuade the finder of fact that they are. But they have a different burden in the two. So when all that's at issue is, say, the allocation of some loss of financial funds, like in a civil case where you're going to sue me for something, the accuser need only prove the defendant's fault by the preponderance of the evidence. When the defendant's very life or freedom is at stake, the burden is considerably higher, and we demand that the prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And so I'm open to this idea. That's why I said just for today I'm going to set aside the interpersonal stuff, that we might demand different levels or different burdens of proof for different types of harm. And it seems that there's a precedent for that already within the law, civil law versus criminal law. I would say even in common everyday practice, there are examples. So you don't even need to take a case where there's intentional harm. That's punishment. But even foreseeable harm, like say you own a newspaper and someone comes to you with a story, a tip of a politician that would destroy their career. This is a powerful person. Now, your intent is not to destroy their career, but that would be a foreseeable consequence of you running the story. And let's say you run the story. I think we were talking about something like this earlier, or someone I was talking with, where there are these groups now that try to go to the news and give them false stories because they want to discredit the media. They think, it's a liberal bias, and so they want to discredit them by having them run false accusations, so then to undermine all the real accusations, right? And they just caught this person recently who tried to do this for a sexual harassment case, right? So let's say you ran the story and it turned out it was one of these organizations trying to discredit the media. I think we could legitimately criticize you for not applying a higher standard, right? So journalistic standards would require that you vet the story, you properly source the story. In cases where there's intentional harm, I think the burden is even higher. Police officers that use deadly force, we say, has to use it as a last resort. All of the measures have to be tried. We could criticize police officers in cases for not or more promiscuously using deadly force. I say in the case of legal punishment, whether I think the severity of harm is beyond debate, we should maintain the highest possible burden of proof. So I'm going to favor a epistemic bar that demands beyond a reasonable doubt. Now there's a good question here. Does this burden of proof carry over to theoretical debates, like the free will debate, like whether we're morally responsible? And I'm going to say yes. So Michael Corrado, a friend of mine, actually a legal scholar at the UNC Chapel Hill, he has given me some help here because he's made this distinction between evidential and prudential burdens of proof. So evidential burden of proof comes into play when there's no real cost associated with a theoretical issue. And prudential burdens of proof are precisely what's at play when there's significant cost associated with the wrong answer. So applied to theoretical matters, he writes, quote, in a purely philosophical contest where nothing of a practical nature hangs on the outcome, it is the evidential burden of proof that's required. And the standard of proof must be beyond a preponderance of the evidence. So simply who has the better argument sort of wins. On the other hand, if there's something practical does depend on the outcome. Now I would say not just something practical, something significantly practical. And in this case, I think that's beyond doubt with legal punishment. Practical implications are quite severe. Then what would matter is the prudential burden. And the costs on either side would determine which allocation of burden we should adopt. So I'm proposing that when it comes to the importance of moral responsibility of legal punishment, and given the gravity of harm involved in these cases, especially, taking away liberty, perhaps even death, deprivation, all of these, the proper epistemic bar that needs to be satisfied is a prudential burden of proof. That's the claim. I'm sorry, who's the retiring professor? Thankfully not here, but on scientific realism or some other metaphysical debate, you might say less practical issues are hanging on it, and so your metaphysics could perhaps favor a lower burden of proof, but a theoretical issue that has this much implication for legal context and for punishment I would argue has to satisfy a higher burden of proof. You might disagree with the level of burden of proof, but so before I give you my arguments for why all the leading accounts sort of fail to meet that bar, I want to first address a move of some retributivists and this is usually legal scholars less than philosophers, think they don't have to satisfy this burden of proof. So there's this great book by Larry Alexander, Kimberly Kessler-Ferzan, and Stephen Morse, and on criminal and crime and culpability, theory of criminal law, and they defend a moderate retributivism in this book. Again, this side note, I don't know if I gave some of you or all of you an updated CV, but Stephen Morse and I have agreed to do a debate book together, debating criminal punishment. And so we're going to lay out our procedures. So I'm going to target him a little today. They've argued that in this book, we need take no stand on the free will determinism issue. And so here they write, very early in the book, they just sort of deal with it and get it out of the way. They say two of us, Ferzan and Morse, are persuaded by the arguments for compatibilism. So I'll come back to them. Right? But one of us, Alexander, is not. His view is that compatibilism provides only a hollow form of moral responsibility, not the full-blooded form that the reactive attitudes assume, and not the full-blooded form legal punishment, I assume, would require. In particular, it seems unresponsive to the worry that what appears to an actor to be a reason, or a reason with a particular positive or negative weight, seems to be beyond the actor's proximal control. On the other hand, he also believes that libertarianism cannot deliver a form of moral responsibility worth wanting because, just like determinism, it's foiled, libertarianism takes control out of the agent's hands and relinquishes it to chance, or he says, or else just makes it utterly mysterious. Well, how then does he continue with the rest of his book, writing a book justifying what the law should look like under moderate retributivism? And this is actually, again, in a footnote. He says in there that neither determinism nor indeterminism can provide a satisfactory account of moral responsibility, and together they appear to exhaust all possibilities. Well, we get this, I think, rather unsatisfying answer. He says, Alexander believes as a meta-philosophical position that the free will determinism puzzle is one of those antinomies of thought that we're just incapable of solving. Like, the mind-body problem or infinite puzzles. For him, the free will determinism puzzle will always dog practices of holding people morally responsible. I guess not dog them enough not to do it, but it might keep them up a little bit, I don't know. Practices, though, that we nevertheless cannot avoid. And because we can't dispense with such practices, a retributivist regarding criminal punishment need not resolve, nor even take sides on the free will issue. All right, I think this is thoroughly unsatisfying. So I have a couple of replies. My first reply is, first of all, why think we can never dispense with the reactive attitudes when it comes to the criminal law? So again, not defending all of my views today, so I'm being a little charitable, but if he were, for example, limiting his comments to our interpersonal reactive attitudes, a la P.F. Strawson, and was saying somehow they were indispensable or centrally important, that'd be one thing. I still think he's wrong, but it'd be one thing. But in this comment, and in the book from which these passages are drawn, they're defending legal punishment. They're discussing retributive legal punishment. And I see no reason to think that retributivism is indispensable from the criminal law. Maybe Strawson's right that it's indispensable from our interpersonal reaction. I don't think that's true, but let's say he is. It's a separate issue about whether that justifies or carries over to legal punishment. So I'd say, first of all, the fact that just some countries have moved away from retributivism, to greater or lesser extents, we might not have completely non-retributive models, but there are some that are far less retributive than others. Certain Scandinavian countries have moved quite far from retributivism. Norway, Denmark have set their objectives as rehabilitation and reintegration as the goals of incarceration. That alone shows that I think the claim that it's indispensable is just empirically false. But more importantly, I'd like to draw this distinction between narrow profile and wide profile reactive attitudes. So narrow profile reactive attitudes would be the immediate reaction one has in a given situation. So maybe in an intimate relationship, if I were harmed in some way that I felt offended by, I might not be capable of restraining my indignation or resentment or one of my reactive attitudes. We had a conversation about this this morning. There might be some who can do it. Some Buddhists might tell me they don't feel these reactive attitudes. Some cultures can say they successfully. But let's just say, I'm not that good, and I'm a free will skeptic. I might still occasionally feel these attitudes. But what's more important is the wide profile. These are the more rationally reflected reactions. And those are what's most important when you talk about public policy and law. From the wide perspective, I could disavow any of those emotional reactions of any justificatory force they have. So there's no reason to say that because I feel a retributive impulse or a retributive intuition in an interpersonal case, that it's indispensable from the law. Because from the wide perspective, the wide profile reactive attitudes, we could disavow it of any justificatory power it might have in the criminal law. So I think it's just wrong about that. Second, I just think to continue to do harm on retributive grounds, even though you acknowledge and very clearly acknowledge that the philosophical foundations of the view can never be comprehended or justified, violates a basic precept that we should restrain from doing harm unless we have good justification. So he explicitly states compatibilism provides only a hollow form of moral responsibility, and libertarian can't deliver any form of moral responsibility worth wanting. That's exactly the same conclusion free will skeptics arrive at. So it's unclear to me why he thinks you should then continue to engage in these practices, moral responsibility practices, and legal punishment, retributive legal punishment, if you hold that view. I don't think you get off the hook by just throwing your hands up in the air saying, it's an antinomy, it can't be solved, therefore, let's continue causing harm. I think the default should be not to cause harm until one feels they have good justification for causing harm. The default shouldn't be to continue to do harm until I prove that your justification is false. Let's switch then to Morse, and I'm going to focus more on Stephen Morse's view than Berzon's view. But they claim they're persuaded by compatibilism. Oh, how persuaded? I know his work pretty well, and he's written a lot about compatibilism, and he has a chapter in my forthcoming edited collection on legal punishment, on the neuroexistentialism book. He has a chapter in there on neuroscience and the law. And he lays his arguments out there. And we've had exchanges already where he just thinks the burden of proof is on me, and I think the burden of proof is on him. So he says the criminal law is a thoroughly folk psychological enterprise. Doctrine and practice implicitly assume that human beings are agents, creatures who act intentionally for reasons, and who can be guided by reasons, and in adulthood are capable of sufficient rationality to ground full responsibility. What he means by full responsibility is basic deserved responsibility, so I'll use my basic deserved, but he says full. Real responsibility. I don't know about that other stuff, it's full responsibility. So he thinks the standard picture, he calls it, is this view, and the law presupposes that. And it takes that standard view for granted, and it also guides our interpersonal interactions. But then he goes on and argues, right, the standard view is also thoroughly compatibilist. There's some debate about that, but I'm going to grant him that for today. I don't know if you're aware of some of the Supreme Court's rulings and the statements about free will. The Supreme Court has written in a very famous decision that the criminal law is inconsistent with determinism. And so some people say that the law presupposes libertarianism. Morse, I think, and he might be right, that it doesn't presuppose libertarianism or the falsity of determinism. It presupposes agents are responsible, and that could just be because they're sensitive to reasons, they act on intents, and it's not. There are some rulings that have indicated the court, at least in the past, has said that if determinism is true, there's no grounds for criminal law. But let's just say he's right. The standard view is compatible and is consistent with compatibilism. And he acknowledges that metaphysical assumptions matter, and especially matter when it comes to moral responsibility, given its importance to the law. But he says the question is whether one must resolve or even defend one's metaphysical or other philosophical foundations in these broad areas. And he says, I think not. And when philosophy is foundational and practically important, he says one's position must be acknowledged but not defended, or a fortiori resolved. And then he goes on and says, when it comes to the free will debate, we reach essentially a standstill. And he's said this to me in person, that I don't know if you're right or I'm right, the free will skeptic's right, the compatibilist is right, and in his view, he's a legal scholar, he doesn't care that much about the philosophy. It's essentially a standstill. People have been debating free will for centuries. But he says, given that it's a standstill, he writes, what is a poor country law scholar to do in such circumstances when trying to make a normative argument about practice, doctrine, policy? And here's his proposal. He says, start with a normative position, so start with like an ethical kind of position, that is attractive at the non-metaphysical level of applied ethics, of applied moral, political, legal theory. And if that position is consistent with a quote-unquote reasonable metaphysics, that doesn't conflict with relatively uncontroversial or at least plausible empirical accounts about the world, and with other reasonable philosophical theories, then one could proceed without defending the metaphysics, the empirics, and the other philosophical positions. Okay, so that's got his view there. And he thinks compatibilism provides a reasonable metaphysics. He doesn't think libertarianism provides a reasonable metaphysics. So on that, he thinks agent causal accounts are not reasonable metaphysical views to have. But he thinks compatibilism is, and because, and this is what he hangs his whole hat on, because there's a lack of decisiveness disproving compatibilism, I'm a compatibilist. A perfectly plausible metaphysics, and will continue to believe that robust responsibility is possible until an incontrovertible argument that all would accept requires me to do it. So before he said they were convinced by compatibilism, what he really means is, given that it's a tie and this seems reasonable, I'm going to adopt this view, and I'm not going to give it up until you provide me with an argument that all would accept. I don't even know what that means. All would accept. But that's the only way he would give it up. So my reply to Morris is that, free will skepticism offers a reasonable metaphysics as well. His likely reply would be, he doesn't like it on the normative level. He doesn't like it when it comes to applied moral, political, and legal theory. But I've argued elsewhere that actually free will skepticism has benefit, not negative consequence. I actually think it makes us less punitive, is less corrosive to our interpersonal relationships, could preserve most of what we care about. But I'll just set all that aside. I disagree with Morris on who carries the burden of proof, and that's where our fundamental disagreement is. He thinks it falls on me. Why? Because he thinks the burden of proof is on anyone who wants to go contrary to current practices. And given that the law, he thinks, it grows out of our folk psychological practices, which have been longstanding and pretty entrenched, the burden of proof is anyone who wants to go contrary to common sense, essentially. Whereas I argue the burden of proof is on anyone who wants to cause harm. And so we have this sort of argument, and I think that not only the burden would fall on him, the burden falls on him to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the case, because I'm adopting that prudential burden of proof. So I would say in response to Morris, maybe he's right in certain circumstances. The person who wants to give a philosophical view that runs contrary to common sense might have to carry the burden of proof. But I think things change dramatically when we're talking about when significant harm is involved. So again, I don't know if scientific realism is the right example, but some examples might be, the ontological status of numbers. I don't know. I don't want to insult anyone. So whatever you think of your favorite example, might be one where if I have a counterintuitive or contrary to common sense view, the burden might be on me. And I might be able to say, well, I have a reasonable metaphysical view, and that's fine. But I think things change dramatically when we're talking about the level of harm involved with legal punishment. So there's that. And then I propose, in the paper from which I'm sort of drawing a lot of this, that we adopt something like a precautionary principle. And I don't want to go too far into that, but some of you may be familiar with precautionary principles and the use of them in environmental ethics, international affairs. The European Union actually has it built into their law, a precautionary principle, but it's also been embedded in the Kyoto Treaty, most of these environmental treaties, the Paris Agreement, and it essentially maintains that so I'll give you the environmental context. In a context where we might have scientific uncertainty, there isn't much on climate change, but let's just say you're a scientific skeptic, and you say, I don't believe that there's scientific proof or consensus that climate change is real. That doesn't still imply that we should do nothing. The precautionary principle maintains that even in the face of scientific uncertainty, one should take precautionary measures to protect public health and safety and avoid harm. So in the past, tobacco execs hid behind the idea that you can't prove causation between smoking and cancer, and because you can't prove causation, the default is that there should be no restrictions on smoking, right? Precautionary principle might say, short of having absolute scientific certainty, if we have good indication that something might be causing harm, that's enough grounds to justify a precautionary principle. So BPA, bisphenol A in plastic. France outlawed it in baby bottles immediately. The U.S. Allows it, but labeling says, you could label something as BPA free. That's because the plastic lobby is pretty powerful in the United States. But nations that depend more on precautionary principles will say, even in the case of uncertainty. So I would say in the case of uncertainty in a metaphysical debate, and I'm not sure we have that in this case, but he says we have this standstill. Precautionary measures should be taken to protect individuals from unjustified harm. So the default should be something like adopting a precautionary principle, which would shift the burden back to his side. All right, sorry. So now, very quickly, I hope I'm doing okay. What about all those philosophers? So Morrison, those guys seem to say, I'm just rejecting your burden of proof argument. But I would think that most philosophers would attack premise 4, which is that they don't believe that their libertarian accounts, their compatibilist accounts, fail to provide the justification needed. And they tend to be more confident, let's say, that they're justified in believing we have free will. So how do those views hold up? I'm going to try to do this quickly, but I'm going to follow Bruce Waller and argue that most of the cases, and I've tried to be pretty exhaustive about this, you tend to find that people's belief in free will and moral responsibility is stronger than their argument for it. And in particular, I'm going to argue that libertarian and compatibilist accounts fail to meet this burden of proof needed in particular to justify retributive harm, because either they tend to be scientifically implausible, as I think is the case in agent causation, I'm going to go through these, or they tend to be empirically unwarranted, as they tend to be in the cases of event causal libertarianism, or they tend to beg the question, as I'm going to argue they tend to do in Strawson and many other compatibilist accounts, or they tend to change the subject, as I think Dennett is a classic example. So real quick, I'm going to start with someone who, low-hanging fruit. I'm going to start with this. Ben Inwagen is pretty easy to see as a good example of someone whose belief in free will and moral responsibility is far higher than his reasons for thinking we have it. So after championing the consequence argument for all these years, which is one of the leading arguments for incompatibilism, right? The basic idea being everything we do is a byproduct, a consequence of the laws of nature and events in the remote past, and you have no control over the laws of nature, events in the remote past, hence you have no ultimate control over the consequences, i.e. my present act. He then proceeds to say, but we must reject determinism, even though, and this is even a title of one of his essays, Free Will Remains a Mystery. That's the title of the essay, and in his book, he's argued. You can't really make any sense, he says, of libertarian free will. Well, he says it. Others have better positions. But he goes on and says, to deny the free will thesis is to deny the existence of moral responsibility. And that would just be absurd, right? So it's this kind of absurdity of what would happen if we adopted that view. So, given the strength of my consequence argument, we have to be libertarian, even though I have no idea how that kind of free will could exist. But his stubbornness doesn't kite. And there he then proceeds to argue that if science were one day able to prove decisively that determinism is true, then and only then do I think we should become compatibilists. You got that. Like, after spending his whole career defending the consequence argument, he'd be willing to throw it out the window, if need be, because his faith that we must have free will is stronger than any of his arguments. Right? So that's pretty clear. I don't think that's going to help justify harm that's required for legal punishment. What about agent causal theorists? Campbell, Taylor, Chisholm, maybe early Chisholm, given our talk yesterday, who are willing to embrace mysterious or godlike powers and the ability in their attempt to preserve moral responsibility. Everyone's familiar with the famous Chisholm passage, right? If we're responsible, and if what I'm trying to say is true, i.e. that we have free will and responsible, then we have a prerogative that some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we really act, is a prime unmoved mover, right? I think that's a far cry from the epistemic standard that's needed to justify punishing someone on the grounds that they possess libertarian free will and therefore deserve it. And I like Waller's quote here. When contemporary philosophers are willing to posit miracles in order to save moral responsibility, the philosophical belief in moral responsibility obviously runs deep and strong. All right. What about naturalistic kind of event causal libertarians? So Robert Kane is probably a classic model, the one probably most discussed. Mark Balaguer is another. Laura Ekstrom is another. They defend sort of event causal. And they jettison sui generis kinds of causes. They don't require a substance, a self, separate from events. They claim that, and I think they're right on claiming this, their accounts are consistent with naturalism, they're consistent with leading scientific accounts of the world. But very importantly, none of them have claimed to have proven that such will exists, or that the necessary empirical requirements posited on their respective accounts actually obtain. Rather, they tend to settle, and both of these guys settle, on the much weaker claim that their theories are consistent with our best scientific theories and have not yet been proven false by science. And the mere possibility that one of these accounts may be true, I argue, is simply not enough to provide the epistemic justification needed to ground retributive harm. In fact, I hate to use such a, I love Bob, he's like the nicest guy in philosophy, Robert Kane. But I would say, in a certain sense, it's moral malpractice to harm on the grounds that we may, in some off chance, have all of these. So let me just give you a quick sense of what would have to be true on Kane's account. I'm not talking about the philosophy part. You could question the consistency of his theory. I don't like the dual willings. Those seem a little weird to me. I think there are philosophical arguments against Kane. I mentioned earlier the settling problem for me is a problem. But there are also empirical aspects of his theory. So remember the businesswoman. She both wants to go to the meeting and she wants to stop and help the person in need, right? According to his account, that phenomenological choice is accompanied by real indeterminism. And it's real indeterminism at the level of events in the brain. And then they percolate up, his argument, to the level of neural networks. And then ultimately one of those neural networks wins out. And that's the result of the choice. And then you're still responsible because you have reasons backing either way that the indeterminacy goes. But on this account, think about it. If multiple mutually exclusive aims, go to the meeting, stop and help the person in need, doesn't cause the brain to go into a chaotic state. The theory is disproven. So it requires an empirical aspect about indeterminacy existing at the right neural network. If it turns out that the neurological systems weren't sensitive to quantum indeterminacy, the theory would be disproven. if it turned out that the neurological systems were sensitive to quantum indeterminacy, but not sufficiently sensitive to amplify up to the level of neural networks or affect choice, the theory would be disproven. And furthermore, even if all of that's true, he has to place the indeterminacy at a very specific temporal moment. The moment after you have good reasons for either outcome and before the choice is made. So if it turned out that indeterminacy could in fact, is it could or couldn't? In fact, could exist at the right level, but happened not to arise at precisely the right temporal moment, the theory would be disproven. I think that these are not marginal, insubstantial bets from brain science. So he hangs his whole hat on, I'm just giving you an in-theory plausible account of how we can have this kind of free will. I'm not claiming we do. I'm not claiming these conditions have been satisfied. And these are, many of these controversial. We have no idea whether these are true, and you have to think that all of these would have to be true, and the theory still overcome all the philosophical objections for us to actually say we could use this as a justification.
Yeah, what exactly do you mean by the agent settling the choice between two incompatible alternatives?
So let's say I go to a conference.
Well, the focus is on the agent.
Yeah.
We don't believe in agent causation.
Yeah.
On your scenario, right? So literally the agent can't settle for you. Can't settle ever the choice between two incompatible alternatives. Taken literally, there would be agent causation for the agents implicit there to settle. So it's got to mean something else, and I'm asking you what exactly it says.
Well, so you would argue, I know you have, you like this account. So I think you would say you don't need settling. That's where you're going.
Well, I'm not so wrong. I was asking you to say what settling.
Well, let me first back. So let's say I go to a conference. I'm a very faithful husband. I'm going to use a bad example. Let's say someone is hitting on me, and I have a temptation to be faithful to my wife and a desire to sleep with this person. Let's just say, it's a bad example. Sorry, it's the only one that's coming to mind. And let's say the quantum indeterminacies happen. I have reasons for doing either, and it turns out I remain faithful to my wife. If I go back to my wife and say, hey, I deserve some praise because some random indeterminacy led me to remain faithful. But by the way, if I rewound time and that same event happened, probabilities would say 50% of the time, or whatever the quantum probabilities turn out to be in this case, I wouldn't have been faithful. That, to me, doesn't capture anything of what intuitively people mean by resisting temptation, by deserved praise, by deciding even. So I don't see how that is a settling on either outcome. I mean, all he says is, I tried to do both.
Well, what is it for the agent to settle? According to the exception, what is it? An agent settles a choice between P and Q, or P and Q are incompatible if and only if.
Oh, all right. So I think
Right.
I think that you don't like it, but it would be that they would have to introduce an agent causal component. That's why I don't think they have the mechanisms to preserve free will, because they don't have the mechanisms to preserve control.
No, I think Gary's question is, do you agree that people sometimes settle on
Settle? Outcomes?
Do you agree that people make decisions that settle on make
I think people make decisions. I think decisions are determined.
do they settle? Do people ever settle?
No, I think well, so Searle kind of goes, the whole system settles, or the whole system is me, and so whatever it is the choice, but I think there's a kind of lack of control. So what settling would be, like if I were to rewind time, there's no control condition, right, that's going to be able to determine beyond chance, or whatever the probability is, what the outcome is. So what power does the agent have in this case to hang responsibility on?
So the settling will require control.
It's a subset of it's a kind of control.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
according to you, since we never control what happens, we never settle.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's your answer to Gary.
Yeah.
This isn't settling, and you think settling is impossible. So at least.
Well, I say impossible, but Derek and I say the agent causal accounts have the conceptual, metaphysical aspects to provide that kind of control. We just don't think that empirically they fit with our best accounts of the world. Yeah, agent causal. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not that it's incoherent. It's coherent, but I don't think it's actual. Yeah, to have agent causal libertarian free will. Yeah, that's a small point. I'm just saying there are people who say it's inconceivable. No. Right, and I say it doesn't have, because of the fact that it's purely on level events, it fails to have the ability to ground responsibility, precisely because it lacks that kind of control.
And can I put it this way, there's no explanation
Yeah.
as to why one rather
You could do it that way, yeah. So you could say, there's no contrastive explanations capable on Keynes' account.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe that would have been easier to just say in the first place. And then very quickly, P.F. Strawson's view, right? So compatibilists, they reject, agent causal kind of miracles and godlike powers. They're consistent with naturalism and determinism. But I think they very seldom justify moral responsibility as a system. Instead, they tend to take what the moral responsibility system is given and then focus on what attitudes or judgments are justified within the system. So I think Strawson is a good example. So he defends the reactive attitudes, and he takes them as our normal moral responsibility practices, and then he proceeds to articulate special circumstances where we could adopt what he calls the objective attitude. So there are cases where we could think that the reactive attitudes are not justified. That's if someone lacks mental capacities, if they are addicted, or some of the delusional or certain impairments would be examples where he says, okay, in those cases, you could accept what he calls the objective attitude. But then he goes on and says the denial of all moral responsibility. Well, that's just unacceptable or self-defeating or impossible, since to permanently excuse everyone would entail that nobody knows what he's doing, or that everybody's behavior is unintelligible in terms of conscious purposes, or that everybody lives in a world of delusion, or that no one has a moral sense. But I think this just begs the question, because it takes for granted the very thing that's under debate. Global skeptics, like myself, like Bruce Waller, like Dirk Piraboom, like Neil Levy, like Galen Strawson, Freudian conflict within the family between PF and Galen. We all basically say the whole system lacks justification. What Strawson is telling me is the only way I could excuse all people is by excuse extensionalism. I just extend the kind of excuses for which we can exculpate people from blame. And that's the only way to get people off the hook. I'm not going to play the game of excuse extensionalism. I'm playing the game of saying the whole system is not justified. Even people with normal capacities lack the ability to be morally responsible for their actions. And so even if Strawson were correct about the necessity of holding each other responsible in our interpersonal exchanges, it's another thing altogether to think retributive legal punishment is justified. Just perhaps one could, and again I'm not saying this is true, but perhaps one could justify adopting a lower evidential standard of proof when it comes to our interpersonal relations. I don't know where I stand on that. But when the level of harm that's involved in criminal punishment is at stake, I think a higher burden has to be met. And given that compatibilism still faces a number of powerful and unresolved global challenges, and you could just enumerate them: the manipulation arguments, the consequence argument, the basic argument, the no forking paths argument, the luck pincer, are all arguments against compatibilism. And even people like Morse, who says he's a convinced compatibilism, understands that he can't respond fully to these objections. It's a standstill. Given that there's legitimate debate about these, given that there are reasonable people who think the compatibilists are wrong, I think it fails to meet the prudential burden of proof. And for retributivists to assume compatibilism is true and proven beyond a reasonable doubt is then to beg the question against incompatibilists and permit unjustified harm. So all of that, do I have time for Dennett? Dennett, I think, just changes the subject. So he's an example. So he had a really insightful exchange about Bruce Waller's book, Against Moral Responsibility. It took place on the naturalism.org website. And in there, when he's responding to Bruce, he says, let me say right away that I agree with Waller and his main conclusion in one important sense. That kind of moral responsibility. He calls it absolutistic moral responsibility, guilt in the presence of God kind of responsibility. That's clearly incompatible with naturalism. That has to go. And then he proceeds and says, retributivism. No, I'm not defending retributivism. Retributivism is completely unjustified. And he proposes a consequentialist defense of just deserts. And he says what he really wants and why he really wants to preserve punishment is to secure a civil society. And his justification for punishment, he makes it very clear in there, is an ultimately consequentialist conception of punishment and reward. The weird thing about Dennett, and I've argued against this in this 2007 paper, is he still likes to use the word desert. He holds on to the notion of desert. It's misleading because his conception of desert is consistent with free will skepticism. It's a forward-looking consequentialist idea that he has in mind. But he could use his terms how he wants. He just makes it very clear. He thinks retributivism is not justified. He adopts a consequentialist grounds for punishment. That's not the kind of compatibilism that's going to help justify legal punishment. So I think in the end, you can't just deny the burden of proof, as Morse does, at least I've argued. And those that try to meet the burden of proof, I say, all fail because they tend to be either scientifically implausible, empirically unwarranted, beg the question, or change the subject. I don't know if you want me to or not with the public health thing, quarantine model, but then I say, with this off the table, and I agree that consequentialist deterrence theories, other alternatives that would be consistent with free will skepticism face, I think, powerful ethical objections, enough to say that those are not acceptable either. Forces me to come up with an alternative, and I've developed, obviously, Dirk's model first with the quarantine model. I built this public health part with it, and then we've written together defending the model. Is a public health quarantine model. You could justify quarantining individuals on a grounds analogous to, so I say I came here to Greensboro, contracted Ebola on the plane on the way here. I'm not to blame for that. There's no grounds for retributivism here. I don't deserve to be harmed. And yet almost all of us would agree that, at least sometimes, we're justifying quarantining individuals for the safety of society. The justification, I say, is grounded not in consequentialism, but in the right of self-defense and the protection of harm to others, which is a widely shared kind of right, or one that's easier to defend, I think, than consequentialism. And the analogous argument would be then we could also give an incapacitation account for seriously dangerous criminals based on the right of self-defense analogous to the justification of quarantine. It would have a number of important implications. It would be non-punitive. If you hold me in the airport or you quarantine me for Ebola, you can't treat me in dehumanizing ways. My view is that the only right you lose is liberty. So you could lose the right to liberty in quarantine, but you don't lose your other rights. I've written papers saying that prisoners should retain the right to vote, and felons should retain the right to vote. So I think we should retain those. You can't, you have a moral duty to treat those in quarantine. So the goal of the criminal justice system should now be reoriented toward rehabilitation and reintegration. And if you did have to hold someone indefinitely because they were a continued threat, like psychopathy is very hard to rehabilitate, although I've argued that there are some successful things that work. You can't treat that person more cruelly than is necessary to protect society. Saul Smolansky has said my view is not punishment, it's punishment. And I have to house people in 5-star hotels. I would argue it's not punishment or punishment. And even if we do that, I still think that you look at Norway. I've used Norway as a model on occasion. I've talked yesterday. I mentioned my design of prisons. Norway adopts the principle of normalcy, which says that the conditions inside prison should resemble the conditions outside prison as much as possible. And if you look at the actual design of the prisons, things like Bastow Island, Halden Prison, you would maybe think of them as five-star hotels. One of them, the one on the island, they have a beach. They run a ferry during the day. The guards all go home at evening. The prisoners have really a lot of autonomy. They have had very little attempted escapes, very little crime within the prisons. And one of the things is you treat someone like a human being, they tend to treat you like a human being. One of the things they've encouraged in the design of the prisons is maximizing movement. They actually want prisoners to crisscross the prison to go to activity. They have like shuffleboard and activities throughout the day. And they want to maximize interaction because the goal is reintegration. Every citizen is going to be reintegrated. The max sentence you could get in Norway is 21 years, even for serial killers. So that everyone will be reintegrated. And the typical sentence is only 1 year. And so if the goal is reintegration, you want to make it as seamless of reintegration as possible, so you can't adopt punitive measures and dehumanizing measures. And then the reorientation in my model is that, yes, I owe you a story of what do I do for dangerous criminals. But the real thing is I want to move away from the myopic focus on punishment or incapacitation and focus on prevention and social justice. So the public health part says, look at real public health institutions, the CDC, the EPA, the Consumer Protection Agency. Their primary function is preventative. So the CDC's mission is to prevent pandemics, outbreaks of disease. The EPA's mission is to prevent contamination of soil, water, air. The CDC will only use quarantine after it's failed in its primary mission statement. It's a stopgap measure. It's an admittance of failure in their goals. So I would say the criminal justice system has to reorient itself to prevention and social justice. And the social justice comes in because I recently argued in a long essay, short ebook, whatever you want to call it, that public health and public safety have the same social determinants. And it's a really statistically founded article. I cite, I think there's a couple thousand studies in there, where things like low economic status, which is a sociological term in social science, it correlates to poor health outcomes, but it also correlates with incarceration rates. Poverty, domestic abuse, exposure to violence. 90% of women in prison have been domestically abused, 90%. And most of them are in prison at the behest of committing crimes at the behest of their abusers or in retaliation to their abusers. Things like diet, nutrition, have poor health outcomes, but they also affect incarceration rates. Environmental health, I say, is a social determinant of crime. So think of Flint, Michigan, and the lead exposure. That's a health crisis, but it also affects incarceration rates. There have been simple ones, dietary, work done on brains of people with psychopathy seem to suffer from omega-3 deficiencies. And there's been some success in just giving omega-3 fish oil to prisoners and actually reducing antisocial behavior. So my argument would be you can address criminal justice without addressing social justice. And that's a big part of my thesis. And then I hold a account of social justice based on a capacities approach like Sen and Nussbaum. And so the goal of criminal justice should be to secure certain capacities for individuals to achieve well-being. And so in a certain sense, our public health institutions are social justice institutions. And yeah, I'll stop there. All right, questions? I'll put my optimistic skepticism slide on. Okay. I don't know. Okay.
So going back to the epistemic core argument, I can imagine the free will dogmatism arguing
I mean the dogmatist who believes in free will, or the one who doesn't.
Believe
Okay.
free will. I would close to the free will skeptic.
Okay.
Free will dogmatist.
Yeah. Okay, we'll call him.
Having to have, do you have a better term?
No, I like it. Go ahead.
They may argue, well, it seems to me that they'd be likely to have some kind of epistemic basis for believing in free will. That is, they would allege. All right, so they might argue, for example, well, let's take an analogy, so we have to do some epistemology, right? So it's been argued that if it seems to me I see something brown in front of me, then in the absence of any defeater of that, I'm prima facie justified in believing that there's something brown in front of me. It seems to me that there's something brown in front of me. Unless I know that there are plenty colored lights shining, and that would be a defeater. Then the fact that it seemed to me there was something brown wouldn't be a good reason for believing that there's something brown. So they might hold a parallel principle about being able to do otherwise. So they might say, it seems to me right now that I could decide otherwise.
Yeah.
And if there is no defeater of that in the offing or present, then I'm prima facie justified.
Right.
So the defeater arises in believing that I could have done otherwise, which is, of course, the key element in a belief in free will.
For a libertarian.
Well, no, for anybody. This is also for compatibilism.
But there are compatibles who don't think you need the ability.
Yeah, but there are those who say you do.
Okay.
They analyze, and it's a theoretical question way down the road whether that entails libertarianism or not.
Sure. Okay.
They might have some of that conditional analysis, like Austin had or whatever, which is totally compatible with determinism, or they might have a libertarian analysis, like Chisholm had, which is not compatible with determinism, right? So on that basis, they believe that. They're flipping the tables on you because they can argue that you don't have a conclusive determinism might be true, but you don't have any evidence that the defeater actually is correct, that determinism is true. So therefore, they're prima facie justified in believing that they can do otherwise, and hence that they're free. We still confront the question of the moral responsibility, and they have some similar principles about morality as well, or that might be settled some other way, the theory of morality, which there are many different theories and stuff. So now they're justified, and you've got to come up with a proof of determinism.
All right. Well, no. All right. So in the Free Will and Consciousness book, I think I offer a defeater. So the big focus on that book was on the phenomenology of agency. And so I think I've reduced what I consider the phenomenology of free agency down to 4 more basic phenomenological features of consciousness, and argue that you can explain how those features arise and why they're illusory. So let's just say I have something, and it's a potential defeater.
There's lots of potential.
Well, I think it's a successful defeater, but let's just say it's a possible defeater, right?
Fact, yeah, it's possible that
Now,
there are weird things that affect my color perception.
Right.
But I have reason to believe
But
that.
I would also say that with the possible defeater combined with the idea that I don't think anyone should think, or I don't think it would be good reasoning or good argument to think that phenomenology is a good guide to metaphysical reality, that combined with a plausible defeater, and the idea that we have many good examples where phenomenology is not a good guide to metaphysical reality, that's not enough justification to justify legal harm. So you might feel that you could have done otherwise.
It would be if you're justified.
Yeah, the phenomenology thing applies to the perception of the defeaters too, right? I mean, you got to get the defeaters stuff.
Well, we all teach, Descartes in intro class and stuff. I mean, we all know that, experience is not always a good guide to reality, and so
we still have to go by it, ultimately. Same with memory. It's all based on this pretty stuff that's potentially defeatable.
Well, right, but we can maybe then make this distinction between, and Descartes would make this distinction between practical reason and theoretical reason. And so at the practical level, if the car is coming towards me, as even Hume would say, I should get out of the way, even though I can't trust induction and all that. But on the theoretical level, I might say, and that might be the level relevant for policy and establishing law.
So you want to reject foundationalism altogether?
And I would say at the level that matters here is the theoretical level.
And that's not foundationally based, that's just all floating.
Well, I would say at that level, we can acknowledge that I can doubt that my experience matches reality. And I can doubt that phenomenology is a good guide to, oh, and I can see how the phenomenology could be misleading. Oh, and I don't have good reason for thinking that, all the arguments against free will are false. So even if it's a draw, I think the default should be we don't do harm, not that we continue with the current practice of doing harm. Because there's lots of historic examples where current practices and we gave those practices. So I think like spanking. I'm trying to think of examples, but you might say spanking was a long-established principle. You might have said, well, you have no good argument for thinking spanking is not justified. You don't even have good consequentialist argument. Maybe it works. We don't, at some point. And so the burden is on you to show me that I shouldn't spank or I'm not justified in spanking. I think our practices quite often change in light of new considerations. And the idea that just because these are our folk psychological practices, or even our long-standing folk, gives no forward-looking reason to think they're continue to be justified. So, yeah, I don't...
Can I ask a different question?
Yeah. Please. I don't know if I'm answering that one well. So go ahead, yeah.
I'm a bit troubled with your tight connection between free will and basic desire.
Okay.
Seems to me you were defining free will
In terms of
basic desire. But that seems to be questionable because Adam's gone, but he mentioned possible asymmetry between praise and blame, which you said you had some sympathy with, but ultimately would reject. But take a fabulous performance by some musician, some solo violinist, which is just wonderful, and the audience leaps to its feet and cheers. Doesn't the musician deserve our admiration? And what does that have to do with free will? There seems to me to be a very clear sense of that person deserves our admiration. Now, you may want to deny that, but it seems to me a fairly strong intuition. And other admirable performances. When we talk about them being admirable, it seems to me what we're saying is they're worthy of or deserving of admiration. But you don't like that.
Well, so I wrote, it's interesting you use that, because I just wrote a paper in Ergo on free will skepticism and creativity, and I argue.
Okay.
So I argue that there's, I actually say, I think there are analogies in the moral realm and the creative realm, because I think both involve interpersonal praise. And we don't just praise the performance, we actually give awards to the individual. So it extends the individual. And so I distinguish between three types of responsibility: attributability, answerability, and accountability. And I say we can preserve two of those. And so I use the examples of Einstein, Miles Davis, and I said, say the case of Einstein, right? And there was the centennial recently of the theory of general relativity. And a lot of newspaper accounts ran praising him for this. And I found this 1932 interview, and he was a hard determinist and agreed with Schopenhauer. And so he says, I don't deserve any praise for my scientific theories. No, I think he's right. But I think you could attribute creativity. And creativity could be defined relationally. So you could say this, like Miles Davis and Jackson Pollock were more creative than their contemporaries because they engaged in, or they produced art that diverged from current norms and current practices, some kind of comparative creativity, and I could attribute that. I could contribute effortful behavior to him. I could attribute a whole bunch of things. And you could also engage in answerability, where you demand an explanation. So I use the example of Bob Dylan going electric at the Newport Folk Festival. Really pissed off his fans Apparently, John Seeger never spoke to him again. And so what would the purpose of answerability be in that case? Not for backwards-looking blame, it's for reconciliation. Yeah, so I would say no to accountability, but you can preserve almost all of what we care about without that. And yes, I do have to give up certain things. I got to give up the thing that I don't think he deserves praise for a good performance.
Yeah, but there seems to be a different way to arrive at the position you want to arrive at without saying what you just said. Because it may be that somebody who does not exhibit free will deserves certain responses, but not other responses. And it might be that such a person deserves admiration, but perhaps doesn't deserve a reward. I'm not sure about that. It might be on the negative side that somebody deserves resentment or indignation or even reprehension, but without deserving punishment. And you might think that, well, one thing that's necessary for deserving punishment is control. But you don't have to exhibit control in order to deserve certain other negative responses.
And we might need to satisfy different burdens of proof for these different types,
yeah,
right?
Quite possibly. See,
yeah.
I'm very sympathetic with your concern about punishment, but I'm less sympathetic with your throwing. I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when you say all basic deserve go down.
Yeah, so I think that is my view. I don't think that was essential to this epistemic argument. That's why I offered it, because people have...
I think it is, because you were talking about how this is an epistemic argument against retributism.
Yeah.
And the argument was essentially, it had to do with the basic deserve.
And it does, but if you're allowing me a distinction between a lower bar for admiration and a higher bar
I'm talking about deserving admiration, but maybe not deserving something else. That's not a lower bar. I mean, it's real desert of some responses, but not of other responses.
But this bar for this type of desert, you would acknowledge can't be met.
Deserving
punishment,
institutional
punishment.
Right.
I'll take that for now.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll also take, so Manuel Vargas has a new thesis that I actually quite like, where he gives this sort of evolutionary account of the reactive attitudes, and he grounds it, and I think it is an odd problem in his account, but he thinks that if you give an account of how things emerged in this kind of functional sense and provide and have survived and have adapted to satisfy certain, have met certain needs, that it gives it some kind of justification. And so for building better beings and that kind of concept he has, he thinks the reactive attitudes have played a very important role in moral formation and in cultural settings. But now says, those arguments don't at all justify institutional punishment. And he believes because the checks and balances that exist, evolutionarily speaking, in the context where the interactive attitudes emerged, were much more local and much more personalized. And when they become institutionalized, the proper checks and balances don't exist, and you can end up with excessively punitive systems of punishment. And so he's not saying we just need reform at the level of institutional punishment. He doesn't think it's justified to take the compatibilist view from the interpersonal to the legal. And even though I disagree with him on the interpersonal level, again, I'll say I'll take what I could get. And at the moment, I'm most interested in policy and legal punishment. So I'm happy to see some compatibilists at least thinking about this, and some of them saying it, that even if they are committed compatibilists, it still may not be enough to justify legal punishment, at least retributive legal punishment. And it's not all I want, but I'll take it. I don't know. Yeah?
If I could just go back to scheduling again, because I'm not sure it's settled.
I knew it. Like the thing that's not my target, the thing that gets. Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure Keynes' model is the only possible one, or whether it's right.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that you're setting it up so that when these things percolate up from the indeterminate level to
neural networks,
the mental level, whatever, right? The indeterminate physical level to the that somehow it's equally probable, like totally random, which one of the outcomes you get. But you don't have to think of it that way. Yeah. It could be any of a range of probabilities, such that one of them is much more probable, given the state of the agent and the state of the environment. And if it turns out that one of them is much more statistically likely than the other, then that'll be the one that's settled by that. For example, when we boil water on a stove, right, it's, according to statistical mechanics, still physically possible that it'll turn into a block of ice when we put it on that. You might have to wait a googolplex of years before you ever see that happen, but it's still physically consistent given the laws of nature. But we would still say definitely that turning on the stove caused the water to boil and in some sense determined it, even though it's not totally determined by the laws of nature. So if you get to a high enough probability, whatever it is.
Well, take it to 1, right?
No, I don't want to take it to 1 because it's not going to be 1. According to this libertarian model, it's going to be statistical. It's going to be right in that sweet spot where it's neither too improbable nor too probable. Right? So it's going to be somewhere in there. I don't know. Depends on your argument. So that's a theoretical level. So. And
that. You want to answer?
So it seems to me you can explain. You can have an explanation.
A contrastive explanation.
Yes. And so the agent can be said to have control. Not in the impossible sense that the agent to 100% can control what happens, because that's not even true in the physical world with anything. So why should that be true for agents?
Are we assuming that the probable is what occurs?
In this, it may.
Yes, what it does. I mean,
it may not.
What if the probabilities were on the side of the
It may not occur. Sometimes agents may not accomplish what they want to.
No, would that mean no control over it?
No, it's a matter of degree, according to this argument. Control is a matter of degree. And when you get over a certain hump, we say the agent does control, but it's not an absolute. It's not an absolute, like, it's entailed by.
If you have this woman who's faced with these two choices between attending the meeting and helping the person in stress, right? And that's the probability. If we could see, look at it from, we could see,
right.
From God's perspective, the probability is very high that she would go to the meeting.
No, decide to go.
Decide to go.
Yes, that's what we're talking about decisions.
Sure. Right. The probability is very high that she decides to go to the meeting, but actually what happens is she decides to help the person in distress. Was her helping the person in distress in her control to any degree?
No, not in that case.
Or not?
So in the case where they come into alignment, then yes. Obviously, in the case where it misfires, no.
Misfire?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a misfire. I mean, you have reasons if it goes that way, and it's a choice. That's your decision.
Well, it depends on what the reason was.
Well, she had some reasons.
Yeah, it's a good reasons. He says you could have good reasons for either outcome.
It's probabilistic. What is the meaning of this?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And even, it's a kind of weird thing. I think he has a response to this, but I once asked him, what if we externalize the indeterminacy? Because in a certain sense, on his account, it's really the temporal moment that has to be indeterminate, less than the spatial. Right? So let's say, someone has a desire to both build a doghouse for their, dog Philo, but also, I don't know, they just got divorced and self-harm or something. And the indeterminacy happens in the saw blade, and I just happen, cut my hand off. I have reasons for having hurt myself, and I have reasons for having continued. And the external event is the indeterminate event that flips it one way or the other. But I have reasons backing either outcome. I think it makes the lack of control a little bit more obvious. And it really doesn't. I don't think it really matters in terms of where the indeterminacy occurs. It's more the temporal place in the sequence where it occurs. Now he says it matters because, and we talk about the self as a kind of whole unit in metaphysics. And so those external indeterminacies couldn't be attributed to a self. And maybe you could say, but I think it just as a hypothetical, it highlights the lack of control for me better.
Back to the hand sewing.
I'm sorry to come with a bad example. These were not meant to be planned examples. Yeah.
So the court currently makes a distinction between those who have capacity and those who don't.
Yeah.
And this does not punish those who fail to have capacity. But are you going to, whether you want to do it the way they do or not, is there any distinction to
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. So I can preserve everything the compatibilist talks about, and I think a lot of great compatibilism work has been done in compatibilism in terms of reasons, responsiveness, degrees of control, people who are willing addicts versus non-willing addicts. I think reasons responsive individuals are different than non-reasons responsive. I just think nothing hangs on that in terms of whether that is enough to ground basic deserved responsibility. I think it matters significantly in court and in the law. So for my model, for example, let's say you have two cases where we have the same outcome. And actually this is unfortunate, but I had a colleague whose daughter was one of those who left her child in a car and died. So she had the stomach flu, and she was up all night. She got like 1 hour sleep. She had to go in. She had 3 children. She dropped the first 2 off. The infant had fallen asleep, and she just went to work. About 6 hours into work, the thought crossed her mind. She went out there, and the child had died. I think that state of mind matters. I think capacities matter because it would affect how we determine what threat level and then what we think is the right course of action for rehabilitation. So someone who's a psychopath or someone who's not reasons responsive might not be as receptive to certain types of treatment or rehabilitation than someone who is reasons responsive. So I think it's essentially important in terms of actually how we determine what we do with different individuals, because talk therapy might work for some, but it's not going to work if you're not a reasons responsive agent.
So the difference is, since this one's reasons responsive and this one's not, we can forwardly
Yes,
deal with them
yes.
differently. But
And
that's
intent.
different.
If you had intent to kill your child and you planned it to look like an accident, that's different than someone who had. So in this case, does she deserve incapacitation? I don't think so. Now, there is a possibility she does. Like if she has a habitual character flaw where she's negligent, she's a negligent parent, then there is a potential risk to her other children. If this is a one-off, and it was caused by stomach virus, and there's no reason to think her. Now, you could also say this event caused now a mental alteration that puts her through. But if we think that this is a pure accident, then I think that
the difference is all forward-looking.
Yes.
Whether they're
Right.
reasons responsive or not
Right.
doesn't make any difference in so far as
In assessing
what
backwards
they
looking.
did do.
No.
It's all simply about what goes forward.
but relevant for that.
But
Very relevant for that.
sure, very relevant for that. Do they actually have to have done anything?
Yeah, so I don't know if I put this in print, but I would say that the actual sequence in the law has to be altered. So what I would say is the first stage should be like a finding of fact, where, again, I need to know that you were the one who left the child in the car, right? Because I don't want to accidentally punish her.
Why?
Or you were the one,
If it's not retributive.
because she would not be a threat to society if she's not at all involved in this event, right? Or I can't, for this reason, assess her as a threat to society. So we need a finding of fact, but the way the trial is set up is we also, in this guilt stage, assess state of mind. I think the state of mind is more relevant for the second stage. So let's say, okay, you both left your child in the car. So that's the first stage. And maybe we don't even call that a guilt stage, we call it something else. And then in the second stage, we decide what we're going to do with the two of you. And you intentionally killed your child, sorry. And you by accident or because of oversight or stomach flu or lack of sleep, then that might license me to have two different courses of action for different cases. So I would say that the way that we currently do it might not be the way it needs to be done.
But why take what we did before at all? I mean, you threw out the mild version of the week.
The weekend, yeah.
That's before. But so why doesn't, if we throw that out, why should we? It's not obvious that we should always take as the best evidence that you need to go to court that you already did or intended to do anything bad. There might be other opportunities for looking through this new judicial system.
So give me some individual to this person or statistical.
Well, it could be either, but if it's statistical, I mean, there are obvious objections to the statistical, but those objections apply to the person hit in a car too. I mean, it's not as if the having done it before now sort of throws out the risk element. That it's still risk element and it's still probabilistic. And it could be that it's even lower probable than some other way.
So, like, I'll try to answer it two different ways. I mean, so first, I would say that you're right. I mean, it is hard to draw this hard and fast line in the sand. I would just try to do it to secure and protect liberty at the expense of allowing harm to be done. Even though I would rather protect the liberty than prevent the harm. But I think I gave you in the Skype interview the example of, if we put in your drink a drug that would cause 100% certainty for you to commit a murder. I think even a hard and fast retributivist, their intuition would be that we have to do something to incapacitate this person for the week. So most, even retributivists, are not just going to rely on retributivism as their justification. They're going to supplement it with something like my justification.
Yeah, but I'm now talking about the weak retributivism. So, so that's to go in the other direction. We know for sure, should we incapacitate? We don't have those examples, but sure, pretty much everyone is going to say yes, incapacitate them, especially if it's temporary. But my question is more, if we're talking about why do something now in the real world, then it could very well, and I expect this in fact true, that predictors of somebody's dangerousness are not that somebody did a bad thing already is not always a better predictor than some other things.
And that's something we would need to know and factor in, because I think there are people who committed crimes and let's keep it on the individual who committed the crime. And I think maybe one of you even gave me the example where crimes of passion within the home. Usually these people, let's say they never marry again, there's no other spouse that's going to be put at threat. More than likely they're not going to commit another crime. We might have to think about what we do to these people.
I'm more worried about the other ones, the ones who we have relatively good predictors.
I want to question this. So what are these relative good predictors? Because you grew up in poverty? Because you...
I don't know, brain scan. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not enough for me.
But I would want some reason for thinking it was a minority report. I think
I'll resist
don't even
it on
know
a...
if it's true now that the best predictors for every kind of crime
and big data is going to change things. I mean, computer modeling. But I would say that I would be suspicious. So the Gattaca, we can distinguish between these. Like the Gattaca one is problematic for me because on the assumption of Gattaca, it's all genetic, right? And I just think that's empirically false, right? So we know even with the statistics I mentioned earlier, how low socioeconomic status, abuse, domestic violence, if you're sexually assaulted as a child, those all matter. So I would just say in theory, I like zombies, but I'm not going to dress in the fluff of your mind because, there's certain things I think, in this case, I could just say, never going to happen. If you want to give me a sci-fi and you force me to answer, I'll try to answer, but I don't think that could happen. In the statistical big data stuff, that's the more problematic. But I would say that we have to be careful of big data to justify individual punishment, or even individual incapacitation.
I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, in homes where there is significant domestic abuse, males growing up in homes with significant domestic abuse. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they are more likely to assault than certain categories of other people.
But I would say that might be not good grounds for incapacitation, but good grounds for my preventative and social justice part of my theory, which is that's where that big data stuff is going to be really helpful to public health. It already is helpful to public health. So if we know statistically domestic abuse, poor diet, violence in the home, have a higher chance of producing criminal behavior. Yes, we're going to have to deal with the people who at the tail end of this come out of the system and unfortunately are going to have to be incapacitated even though they don't deserve it. It provides us with more reason to engage in the interventions.
Whether they want to or not.
Now, again, this is complicated, right? Because I have for example, there is all this really good stuff on brain scans and psychopathy. And Adrienne Rain is someone I've known, have shown amygdalas are diminished and prefrontal cortexes are diminished. but there's a fine line between the benefits of public health and the fear of stigmatization, right? So we also have to figure out what to do with this information. So if we start demanding brain scans of people in certain communities and then labeling them as having high probability for sociopathic antisocial behavior, that could be self-fulfilling, and it could be stigmatizing, and it could be more negative than good. But then there's other big data statistical modeling that could be used very effectively. But I would say not for the purposes of intervention, for incapacitation, but now what interventions? You know, then we can go back to the nudge talk yesterday, right? What interventions and how well, never, not really for me, but I would say interventions in terms of making sure we go into inner city schools, making sure we address what's happening in the home, making sure we provide financial incentive, making sure we fund programs we know work, making sure we have counseling for people who are sexually assaulted or domestically abused. And so I would say that's not going to, for me, in most cases, statistically push me over the edge and say you're enough of a threat. But it can justify targeting that for certain types of protections. And by the way, police departments are already doing this for good or for bad with these weird, different types of models. You can even download apps now. Like if you live in a bad city, like Chicago or something, you could look at an app that, based on statistical modeling, just hour to hour, like a weather forecast, will tell you where crimes might likely to happen. And you could do it based on things like weather, right? Crime goes up when the temperatures rise. And they could focus on this, and it can help police departments police those neighborhoods more, or put more people on the streets, and in a certain sense, you can, it's kind of weird fatalism where, like, you don't know, you could avoid the thing that's predicted to be the outcome. And so those things we could debate, and that's more like the nudge debate, though. Is that too intrusive? Is that profiling? And I'm open to that conversation, and I don't know the answer to that. But I would say that's probably the level in which my view is going to end up having more trouble, I hope, than the level where we're preemptively going to.
It's a kind of related but different tack. You were mentioning a problem about prisons being, quarantine centers being too...
punishment?
Yeah. Do you think it can be plausibly argued that that in non-ideal circumstances, on a temporally limited or contingent basis, that the fact that, the desire not to incentivize criminal activity can be used as an argument for not making quarantine centers too cushy, because if we do, right, given that we're not addressing poverty,
I gotcha.
We might be incentivizing crime on the basis that people who want to go to a nice place for 20 years are not taking.
Since I'm not a consequentialist, I hope I'm more immune to that. And maybe you go the other way. Maybe you think that's a good reason. I would say no, because again, the treatment of the individual can't be, a poor treatment of the individual can't be licensed even for gain, for consequential gain. So that's why I'm not basing it in deterrence or something. And that's not actually punitive, so it's not a punishment theory really either. And so I think punitive or intentionally punitive design.
I was talking about making it not too cushy.
But how? By making them caged or?
No, by not having like giant swimming pools and which are things which they would be able to do if they weren't quarantined, but which not like putting them in solid.
I also question the underlying assumptions. So like it doesn't seem it doesn't seem like they have a deterrence problem in Norway. So we have 5% of the world's population.
They don't have the social inequities.
That's true. But it's combined with the other aspect of my theory, which is the social justice. So they're better at that.
No, I agree that we ultimately solve those things that are making our situation not ideal. You don't have to
Right.
You wouldn't have this problem then, because the only people that would be going in are people who
Yeah.
have a great life and still do this stuff.
Right, right. But I think the loss of liberty is a huge deterrent, and there might be some instances, in some cases, you could always point to someone who commits a crime so they get shelter. But I think the vast majority of people, even in unequal societies, are not going to want to go to a punishment institution, and so. But even if it turned out, I just don't know if I could license negative treatment or reducing. I don't know how far we want to make the conditions.
Well,
right
matter.
Yeah,
And
matter.
it's also a matter of funding, right?
Yeah.
So even if you're not imposing bad things
Right.
on them, what's
Yeah, I don't
you
wanna
have
do
to
that.
provide them with a pool?
Right. So we always talk about funding priorities and
Yeah.
where to put them. So education, we have to decide how to prioritize education. And yes, a better school where everyone gets a free iPad would be a better school than one that doesn't. And so we just might have the funds to do that. I don't think that that's punitive, right? And that's just
No, right.
yeah, right.
Right.
So
Sure, but it
right.
doesn't but there'd be a real question of how much
Yeah.
nice stuff you got to.
Right. So I might not have to give them. You don't have to give them everything, but I would say that I would say though that the design though we do have to consider the environment of a prison, the dehumanizing aspects of the design of U.S. prisons, and if we're going to adopt a non-punitive
No, I
system.
think a
we have
big
to-
part of the answer is going to depend on to what extent you or whoever
Yeah.
is a consequentialist or not. So,
yeah, yeah.
and you're not, you
Yeah,
said so.
yeah, yeah.
If one was, then
Yeah.
but if not, then
Yeah. Have you heard
gotta go
about?
by your principles,
Yeah, the
whatever
UK
they are.
passed this ban the book movement in prison, and the only thing that could fuel that is a retributive impulse, right? And the idea, luckily the High Court struck it down, but the idea is that they shouldn't have these luxuries. But if your model is rehabilitation and reintegration, books are really important for rehabilitation.
No, books
And,
are very-
and
we
even
don't
in the
want
pure
to-
self-interested model, we want people to come out better than they go in. And if the goal is to reduce recidivism, these retributive programs and policies don't work.
Yeah.
No, but books have always been.
I'm gonna interrupt you.
Prisons.
Yeah.
Now, Michael says he wants time for lunch.
Yeah. What time do I have to get to the airport? Jeez. Thank you.
This isn't the lowest in libraries, even law libraries. But that's not really a contradiction. You know, like a They would do 3D theaters in every. I think even in Norway they're pretty. They really have.
What time is yours, right?
So my boarding is at 5. Yeah. So I don't know how far it is and what time I
It
should
doesn't
get
take
there.
so long to know, but
I get there by 3:45 or. Yeah. I just got to get my bag out of Heather.
Sure. I don't know where you like it. There's
Simple, anything.
a draft house, I think, or just up the street.
Sounds perfect.
Yes, Sam.